I guess we're going to begin to introduce our final project here with a brief recap of what our program is all about, and then we'll launch into the project presentation. So thanks again to everyone for being here, and we're recording. And as many of you have already been here, but if anyone just popped in to begin, we're here. This is the Caltech JPL Art Center Data Visualization Program final presentations. And I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what this program is about. Before I do that, I just want to give you a quick explanation of what we're going to be doing to kind of manage everybody's bandwidth who's presenting. We're going to ask you to keep your microphones and video cameras off during the presentations, and then during the Q&A, we will turn video back on to for the presenters and for the conversation. So just brief welcome on behalf of all of us who co-organized this program. I'm Hilary MUSHKIN. I'm a research professor of art and design at Caltech. Scott Davidoff is the human interfaces group manager at JPL. Maggie Hendry is the chair of interaction design and the graduate media program at Art Center. And Santiago Lambeda is a senior staff researcher at Caltech and also on the faculty at Art Center. And we've been working with a group of fantastic interns this summer on 3 projects: Barbara Alonso, Martin Bernard, Dan Kalachi, Lucas Herman, and Rachel Waterhouse and Austin Wright. And the 3 projects that they have been distributed across across the 3 different research groups at JPL and Caltech, with Meghana Kumar at JPL leading the Flight Rules Project, Victoria Orphan at Caltech leading a project looking at ocean seafloors and with her lab, and Tapio Schneider looking at climate and cloud at Caltech in his group. We've been doing this for 8 years, and this is our 8th year. And one of the things that I'm really excited about with this particular presentation that we're about to have here is that it's going to give us a closer look at what our process is actually all about. So this is the first time that we've actually been able to have somebody, another intern, that's really giving us a closer look at this methodology and what we are contributing as our own in our own processes to think about what interdisciplinary practices mean to the development of discovery. So we, as I mentioned, we had 3 projects and 6 interns. The interns have been working, each of the computer science interns is dedicated to one of the 3 projects, and 2 designers work on all 3 projects. And then Dan, who's about to give his presentation here, he's identified as the art lead, but thanks to the pandemic, the question of what he could make sort of became a little bit more constrained. So we ended up doing something that was more of a critical analysis coupled with art thinking, which you'll see. I think that I just want to say one other thing, which we'll get into a little bit more in depth when Dan gives his presentation here. But our process is based on a user-centered design and the iterative processes that are involved in that. And so we've adapted user-centered design to the context of data visualization, science, and software development. And now I think we're going to get a chance to think about what really does this, how does this process impacted different ways that we think about discovery as a sort of broad concept. Dan, I think, is going to ask you to do this, but I'll just explain that he has a specific request in terms of how you set up your Zoom interface right now. If you can put your the speaker side on this one side and your presentation on the other side so that you could see him talking while he's presenting, that would be great. So I'm going to turn it over now to Dan.
Thank you, Hillary. Can everyone hear me? Anyone who has video, maybe you can. Good, okay. I'm going to share my screen. Great. Okay, the slides are visible to everybody. All right, well, hi, I'm Dan Kalachi. I'm a PhD student at the Media Lab at MIT. Today, I want to talk to you about how programs like the Data2Viz Lab fit within the worlds of science and design, and what my experience sitting in on the lab for the past 10 weeks has shown me about them. I want to mention in the title slide, very first thing, that I've been advised for the past 10 weeks by Hillary, who you just saw. This is really, in a lot of ways, a collaboration between me and her, and it's been great to be advised by her. Like Hillary mentioned, this project is about multiple perspectives, and the imagery in this talk is going to end up being a kind of parallel narrative. This is not going to be like the previous talks. Instead of building a single piece of software or coming up with a design, my job for the past 10 weeks has been to think critically about how the Data2Viz program operates within the worlds of design and science. And because it's about parallel perspectives, this talk does the same thing. So the imagery in this talk is kind of a parallel narrative to the text, what I'm going to talk to you about. So I want you to treat them as two different ways of thinking about the same thing. And like Hillary mentioned, probably the best way to do this is to situate your Zoom setup so you can see me and the slides in side-by-side mode, and you have the speaker view turned on. So my face is bigger than just a tiny, tiny little box. But okay, with that disclaimer, I'll get started. So like I said, our project for the past 10 weeks has been exploring the different ways we come to know things about the world, and through the lens of how designers and engineers in the Data2Viz program do their work. And to do this, we've illustrated and recorded the Data2Viz program's process using a variety of methods. Doing this helps illuminate the various tools, perspectives, and systems that are inherent in different ways of learning about the world, of knowing, and the differences in perspectives that the Data2Viz program in particular highlights. These uniquely designed tools that come out of the Data2Viz lab, the ones you've seen earlier, they're made by blending the expertise of both domain scientists and outside designers and engineers. And this combination of perspectives, of domain expertise on the one hand and design expertise on the other, enables these projects to be more than just pieces of software. One of the projects of this program really is to develop a lens through the software that gets designed that's tailored to the way that these specific research partners see their work, their problems, and the world. In this way, the Data2Viz program's process and the software produced at the end of the program and everything made throughout the process are artifacts of some articulation of where holes exist in our research partners' process. As part of creating these designs, Barbara, Rachel, Austin, Lucas, and Martin, they create their own sort of knowledge about how these research groups operate, what's important to them, and what their biggest challenges seem to be. And the way this knowledge is made often uses really different methods from the research groups that they collaborate with. To understand all these scientists' works, Barbara, Rachel, Lucas, Martin, and Austin used Zoom calls, lots of them, screenshots and screencasts of their existing tools, the ways they do their work now, photographs, testimony, and archives of projects, methods, tools, and process. And all of these things that they've collected and that were made available to them are artifacts of the messiness of doing science, of what happens in the lab. And what I want to highlight is that they did this. They created this knowledge by engaging in what was really primarily a social process, interviewing and listening deeply to what these researchers claimed were their biggest problems. And then returning to the studio to assimilate by talking with one another, iterating designs, trying to develop new lenses that the researchers could then use to do their work in the future. In the same way that the research teams offered artifacts of their process, we've collected some artifacts of our own over the past 10 weeks, detailing how these teams work to build the prototypes that you've seen today. The early sketches produced by the teams focused on, pretty simply, how to represent the data, what it looks like, what the information that these scientists used to construct their knowledge. Some of this happened through creating prototypes for final tools, but at their core, at their most simple, these explorations were just other ways of understanding the goals and perspectives of the researchers through the data they use, the data they measure, and the data that they eventually represent in their work, in papers and visuals. And so exploring these representations of the same data the researchers use is in a lot of ways complementary to the actual inquiry process, the social inquiry process. These representations they made offer a parallel perspective to inquiry, to the social process of discovery, but one that still asks similar questions about the goals and the reasoning behind the data itself. What are you collecting? Why? What's so important about this measurement over that one? Why? What are the core large questions that these data can help you answer? Now, I'm a scientist too. I'm a computational social scientist. I study human behavior using technology, and watching the layers get peeled back in the scientific process through inquiry, watching the researchers painstakingly explain the shared known context within their lab to outsiders reminded me that sometimes we get lost in this data as scientists. We forget where it comes from, how it was collected in the first place, how it's linked to our driving questions, and all the tools and processes that mediate its measurement. Hearing scientists talk about their data and also about the embodied human process involved in collecting, organizing, and interpreting it all in the same breath reminded me as a scientist of all the perspective that data can actually hold. For example, one of my favorite parts of the data from the Orphan Lab was the characterization of different microbial mats using aesthetic descriptions. Seeing these artifacts through the team's processes reminded me that the data we collect and how we categorize that data, how we categorize our observations is often situated. It can be situated within some scientist's process, situated within a group's history, or even dependent on an entire discipline's norms and values. The data we collect and how we represent it is often dependent on the norms and tools available to us, whether it's data collection tools or entire methodologies developed in our disciplines. And yeah, as scientists, we try our best to leave these things at the door when we do our work. There's an ideal, right, of producing scientific knowledge while compensating for the fact that we're people with bodies that we use to see the world and understand. We try to leave those perspectives out of the work we create and compensate for the fact that our observations, our choices of analysis, and sometimes even the basic questions that we ask are dependent on who we are, our values, and our perspectives. But too often, compensating for our perspectives, how we're situated, can actually turn into ignoring the tools, norms, and practices we have that color our perspective. And the questions we ask is easier than interrogating what those things are and how to do our work in spite of them, or at the very least, how to be transparent about them in a way that actually enables better science. To use data visualization as an example, as Catherine D'Ignazio and Rahul Bhargava note, situating data visualizations is understanding the context in which they're made, what assumptions they hold, like the ones created by these tools or simply produced by any research group, can be a particularly tricky problem. This is because, as media scholar Helen Kennedy observes, the conventions in how we present and develop data visualizations, including things as innocuous to scientists as clean layouts and generally using geometric shapes, these all work to make the data represented appear as objective, transparent, and factual as possible. They work to hide the perspective behind the visualization, behind the data. And to be fair, while that's a critique, it's not necessarily a bad thing. And it's certainly understandable. We have a clear incentive to make our designs appear as objective as we can. After all, that's the core goal of science, isn't it? We try to present what we learn as objectively as possible. If it was easy for a viewer to situate our work as coming from, say, a far-right political perspective or something like that, it would just be as easy for people to dismiss it as heavily biased, as bad science. In a time when science is increasingly under attack and politicized, it's more important than ever to be aware of that dynamic. But as many historians of science have shown, the goal of presenting our work as unassailably objective extends way beyond the visualizations we use to create or communicate science. It's pervasive in how we write about, frame, and design research in the first place. To use a really simple, common example, journals have firm formatting and even tone standards that writers need to follow. And these are often employed to construct a tone that encourages an objective perspective. But we have to acknowledge there's some risk here, because instead of encouraging us to question and address our perspective in our work, how we're situated, some of these norms too often simply encourage us to forget that we're situated at all. Because instead of encouraging us to acknowledge where we're situated, we're encouraged simply to produce work that makes itself appear objective and authoritative. While this whole process undoubtedly helps science gain authority, it can also play a big role in producing bad and unethical science. So I'm going to show you a recent example from my field of the social sciences. In July 2020, the National Bureau of Economic Research, this is last month, released a paper where the researchers cut off water in vulnerable communities in Nairobi. And they did this as a way of incentivizing utility payments using a randomized controlled trial framework. For anybody who works with human subjects ever, this should be a really clear violation of research ethics. So a big question in my mind was, how did this come to be? Like I've been alluding to, science and technology studies scholars note that the work we do often depends on our social standpoint. This refers to who we stand with when we do our work. In this case, the researchers were standing with the utility company, testing potential policies. And instead of addressing this potential conflict or bias, the language used in the paper actively works to divorce their work from the goals of the utility company or that standpoint entirely. And this led not only to an unethical research project, but to a paper that forces any discerning reader to basically do investigative work to understand the full context it was written in. When talking about the designers in this program earlier, to roll back a little bit, I talked about how the tools they use to create the visualization projects are sometimes different from the ones that scientists use. And when I say tools here, I mean more than just software. I mean the methods, norms, and approaches to solving problems that they value. The designers in this program leverage inquiry and social interaction heavily. They're situated tools that are expressly concerned with the perspective of the person they're designing for, approaches that aren't often valued in some disciplines of scientific research. And while the data visualization systems they make are often useful for entire research problems or fields, it's also acknowledged that the specific context they're made in impacts their design. Ultimately, every tool we design, including the ones in this program, are some articulation of the people, the context, and the science involved. If these teams had worked with different stakeholders, the tools would have adopted a different design. And I'd argue that it's no coincidence that design is often distinguished from science by scholars as being a more embodied discipline, that it's obsessed with perspective. If your main tools are inquiry, if your expertise is in how to ask questions of people, it forces you to confront the fact that you have a perspective too, and that any knowledge you produce is dependent on it and is situated. And I keep talking about tools. In language, the Worthian hypothesis suggests that the languages we know help define the limits of our thinking. While the strictest version of this hypothesis has been largely discredited, it's still thought that language, the main tool we use to know, has an enormous impact on the way that we think. Now, I'm a scientist, like I mentioned. I study human behavior and social systems using technological tools. And reflecting on my own work, I mainly use statistical or computational tools. I spend a lot of time in R and the command line. That's my training, and it's what I know. Sometimes I build or design software or design experiments, but I usually build things for a specific purpose, to measure. Most of what I do actually can be seen as developing new ways of measuring human behavior so we can use these computational tools to test some social theory or policy. Because my main tools, my main ways of knowing are numerical and computational, I obsess and focus almost exclusively on ways to quantify or measure. And this colors how I approach any new problem, including the ones here. I don't often engage in ways of knowing that aren't quantitative or numerical. These tools I've been trained in and that have been designed for my scientific field situate me. They help dictate and define what problems I'm motivated to work on and how I approach them. These frameworks that we have for solving problems, the way that we represent and view the world, the norms of what methods are appropriate to use in which context, as well as software and hardware, these are all tools we're trained in and that are available to us and that we all agree on as scientists in specific disciplines as scientific or disciplinarian ways of solving a problem or answering a question. These tools are a crucial part of how we perform scientific work, and they're an enormous part of what situates us, of what defines our perspectives as scientists. But when science forgets its perspective, when our norms push researchers to forget or ignore how they're situated or where they stand, they also push us to forget the tools that we use. So what about the tools designed here in this program? What makes them special or different or interesting? Well, if the tools we use are part of what situates us, then the tools we want reflect how we want to be situated and reflect how we're trying to see the world. Like ants, we find a course somehow and create, explore, and test paths forward. This is part of that process. So in this way, these data visualization tools in this program are much more than just pieces of software. The tools and all the sketches, the prototypes and designs, they're artifacts of a discovery process, of discovering how these research groups see the world, what they find important, their pain points, what's missing, and what they want to know but can't get a handle on. Forgetting or losing that perspective also makes this process of co-designing software and artifacts like the ones presented today impossible. These tools are snapshots of the perspectives these research groups have towards the world, demonstrating how design can enable better science by creating these artifacts. Also demonstrates the importance of understanding and communicating our perspective and standpoints as researchers, and how being transparent about them can help us build better tools and perform more rigorous science. The project of science is to turn situated knowledge into something that can be applied generally for others to use and build on, not to ignore that it's situated in the first place. So that's sort of the end of what I've worked on for the past few weeks. A collection of curated artifacts, some early pieces and sketches, and some critique around how to situate programs like the DataVis Lab within design and science more broadly. But I want to take a moment to acknowledge that this, I don't think, is going to be the end of this project as a whole. We're hoping to take all the work we've done here and things we haven't shown you and use it to inform a physical exhibit or a mixed media essay exploring these topics. Because maybe some representation of all these artifacts we've produced and created can help a general audience ask their own questions about the relationship between design and science and about the standpoints we take when we perform them. But obviously we're limited by COVID this summer and building a physical exhibit wasn't quite possible yet. So that's the end of this talk. I want to thank Hillary, Scott, Santiago, and Maggie for offering unparalleled mentorship and support over the past 10 weeks during this insane period of time. And huge thanks to Barbara, Rachel, Martin, Austin, and Lucas for painstakingly recording and saving their work and process for us to archive and pour over. And in the next few weeks, send them to us. And finally, JPL and Caltech for hiring me for what was really a really open-ended project for a summer. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. That was great to hear. And I wonder if I don't see any questions in the chat right now. So one thing you wrote in your slides is ask me about your computationally generated text paths. So maybe you want to talk about those now a little bit.
Yeah, maybe I'll just skip to that one of those slides real quick. if I can manage to do it. Wow, the fading transitions are really nice when you're doing a talk, but they really make it hard to go back. Oh yeah, there we go. Yeah, so something I did, I mentioned that my sort of framing and training is as a computational social scientist. So a lot of the ways that I think about representing social interaction has to do with quantitative ways of knowing. So one of the things that I did in the middle of the 10 weeks was we have all these transcripts of the Zoom calls that students engaged in, right? So conversations between them and researchers trying to understand what the goals of the project should be. One of the things that I did was create these representations of those transcripts using modern text analysis tools. So these are this is a snapshot of an entire transcript that the designers and researchers engaged in. And the things that I've sort of outlined as questions are rendered legible while the responses aren't, to try and highlight the importance of this inquiry process in the whole project of the Data2Dis lab. But the most interesting thing, or at least one of the most fun things about it, is that where the text is sort of moving, where it's positioned, depends on the topic of that sentence in the conversation. So over here, this is a different topic, although I couldn't tell you exactly what it is, than the text that's over here. They're discussing different things. And this is all automatically generated using modern language models. And so we have some interactive sketches about this. We have, some animations about the text sort of appearing. We are developing these into larger prints and stuff like this. That's the ask me more part of this that I thought would detract in the middle of the talk.
I think it's really interesting because we sometimes use the phrase circle around to talk about people, what people are going to talk about if they are, writing something or presenting something. And so you've actually literally made that visual here where it shows the conversation circling around different topics and then winding its way to another.
And the questions leading between them, right? Connecting these different loops. So.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that I remember you talking about with that particular idea is that the question asking seems so like innocuous, but in fact that's sort of a big that's a skill that our group brings to the discovery process, is asking questions in order to move along and kind of develop some aha moment, which is what we've been talking about.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that one of the biggest feedback from all the researchers, even at the end of these talks, was like, oh my gosh, you really sort of figured out what we're doing in our group over 10 weeks without any background knowledge. An enormous part of being able to do that is expertise and guidance in how to ask questions about people's process. And so to me, that was like one of the first things that I found really incredible about watching what designers and researchers work, was their ability to really carefully and skillfully go through this inquiry process to learn what they needed to understand about the perspectives that these research groups had.
So I see Victoria wrote in here, do you have in the chat a question? Do you have ideas on how to use visualization to share our scientific processes to the general public?
It's a good question. I think one thing is being able to understand the social aspect of producing science. I mentioned I'm a scientist myself, and something that I say in the talk is I forget constantly, especially when I'm producing a paper and submitting it to some journal, that so much of what that paper is the product of the specific people involved and our interactions over time and the dynamics of our team. And those discussions, that happen in the afternoons or in the hallways or even late at night between you and your colleagues. And that gets completely lost in the artifacts that we produce as scientists. So being able to, I mean, I think one of the ideas that's sort of being hinted at by the TextPath sort of thing is being able to visualize that social process in a way that maybe makes sense. I think the current version of it is a little convoluted, but I think that there are definitely ways of being able to communicate that that's happening, on the back end without necessarily sharing exactly your conversations or revealing your secret sauce, but like being transparent about how that process operates. And I think visualization can play a role in that. It would be interesting to me if a journal or conference, especially for certain fields, encouraged people to try and think, people who are practitioners, to try and think critically about how to share their process with others. So much of what we do in conferences and journals is sharing our work, but not sharing how we do it. And I think that that's an important question to ask. Oh, Hilary, you're muted.
Thank you all for, thank you, Dan, and thank everybody for joining us today. It's been really a pleasure to have the opportunity to share this work with you. If anybody would like to stay for a more extended conversation, we're happy to stick around. Otherwise, very grateful to all of you for being here with us today and hearing about our projects. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. Yeah, amazing work, team. And everybody, if you can, you feel free to turn your video on and turn your audio on and just share a quick congratulations. Amazing work. Thank you, everybody.